The Nebraska prairie stretched endlessly beneath a cloudless sky, golden wheat fields rolling toward a horizon that seemed to promise both fortune and heartbreak in equal measure. In 1902, this vast landscape belonged to men with iron wills and deeper pockets, men like Colonel Harrison Blackwood, whose cattle empire spanned 3 counties and whose reputation for ruthlessness was whispered about in every saloon from Omaha to the Colorado border. But even men like Colonel Blackwood couldn't buy everything money could reach. Love, for instance, or redemption, or the kind of woman who could transform a life from the inside out. This is the story of how a man born to command learned to surrender. How a woman society had written off as worthless became the foundation of everything that mattered. And how sometimes the greatest investments aren't measured in gold or land, but in the courage to believe in someone everyone else had abandoned. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Colonel Harrison Blackwood was not a man accustomed to failure. At 47, he'd built an empire through calculation, timing, and an almost supernatural ability to recognize opportunity before anyone else saw it coming. His ranch, the Blackwood Estate, covered nearly 80,000 acres of prime Nebraska territory. His cattle numbered in the tens of thousands. His influence extended into the territorial governor's office and beyond. He wanted for nothing the territory could provide except an heir. That was the problem that had begun to consume him with an intensity that surprised even those closest to him. His first marriage, 20 years prior, had produced no children. His second wife, a society woman from Boston, had proven more interested in spending his money than bearing his sons. When she'd left him for a railroad magnate with a more fashionable address, Blackwood hadn't pursued her return. Instead, he'd done what he always did when faced with an obstacle. He'd calculated the most efficient solution. He needed a wife who could give him children. Not a woman of breeding or social standing. He'd tried that twice and found both wanting. What he needed was a woman whose primary purpose was reproduction, whose gratitude for escaping whatever circumstances had defined her previous life would translate into cooperation and compliance. He needed a woman who understood that this was a transaction, not a romance. The solution presented itself on a Tuesday morning in early spring when his foreman, Marcus Webb, arrived at the ranch house with a proposition that was equal parts genius and morally questionable. "There's an auction," Marcus said without preamble, setting his hat on the table in Blackwood's study with the familiarity of a man who'd worked for the same employer for 20 years, down in Council Bluffs. They call it a marriage auction, though it's nothing official. Charity event, supposedly, designed to help desperate women find situations. Blackwood looked up from the ledger he'd been reviewing, his expression revealing nothing. A marriage auction? You can't be serious. I was skeptical too, sir, but I've heard it discussed in town. Women in difficult circumstances put themselves forward. Farmers, ranchers, eligible men come to bid. It's handled discreetly, but it happens. And from what I understand, there are some truly desperate cases. Women with nowhere else to turn. Blackwood set down his pen carefully. He'd heard rumors of such things, though he'd assumed them to be urban legend, the kind of scandal that made for dramatic storytelling, but had no basis in reality. Yet the more he considered it, the more it began to make a certain kind of sense. Better, certainly, than the conventional routes he'd already exhausted. "And you think I should attend this auction? I think you should consider it, sir. You're a direct man who appreciates efficiency. This seems tailored to your temperament." 2 weeks later, Blackwood found himself in a rented carriage, rolling toward Council Bluffs with Marcus beside him and a growing sense of either foolishness or destiny. He couldn't quite determine which. The auction was held in a church basement of all places, which struck Blackwood as either appropriate or deeply hypocritical, depending on one's perspective on such matters. The room was dim, lit by oil lamps that cast everything in uncertain shadow. Perhaps 20 women stood in a loose line along one wall, ranging in age from barely 18 to pushing 40. They wore whatever finery they'd been able to assemble, though poverty was evident in the seams and patches, in the worn fabric and careful alteration. Most avoided eye contact, some looked defiant. A few appeared resigned to whatever fate this evening would bring. An auctioneer, a thin man with silver hair and a manner that suggested he was deeply uncomfortable with his role, began describing each woman in turn. Her age, her health, her skills. He spoke about them as though they were cattle or farm equipment, which Blackwood supposed was the point, though the dehumanization was jarring even for a man as pragmatic as he was. Most of the bidding was modest. $50 here, $75 there. Men of modest means, looking for practical solutions to domestic needs. Blackwood watched it all with the detached interest of someone observing a transaction in which he had no real stake. Then the auctioneer introduced the final candidate, Rebecca Marie Hartwell, age 28, originally from Philadelphia, recently relocated to the territory seeking employment. Exceptional homemaking skills, including cooking, sewing, and household management. Physically healthy, though. The auctioneer paused, clearly uncomfortable with what he'd been instructed to say next. Though she's been informed by multiple physicians that she's unlikely to conceive, listed as barren. Despite this limitation, she's seeking a marriage arrangement and is willing to enter into an agreement for nominal consideration. The woman who stepped forward was not what Blackwood expected. He'd imagined desperation would be visible, poverty written across her features like a diagnosis. Instead, Rebecca Hartwell carried herself with a dignity that seemed almost defiant. She was tall, perhaps 5'9", with the kind of lean strength that suggested a life of physical labor. Her hair was dark blonde, pulled back in a practical braid. Her face was striking rather than conventionally beautiful. Strong bones, intelligent eyes, a mouth that suggested she had opinions and didn't hesitate to voice them. But it was her expression that caught Blackwood's attention. She looked at the assembled men with neither fear nor shame, but with something closer to assessment, as though she was evaluating them rather than being evaluated. The opening bid came from a farmer in the third row. $20. The auctioneer looked toward the rest of the room, clearly surprised by even that modest bid. In the context of the evening's previous sales, $20 was almost respectful. "Do I hear more?" No one else raised their hand. The farmer was about to win Rebecca Hartwell for $20 when Blackwood, surprising even himself, raised his hand. $1, he said quietly. The room fell silent. The auctioneer blinked, uncertain he'd heard correctly. "I'm sorry, sir?" $1. $1, Blackwood confirmed. "That is a valid bid, I presume?" "The woman is listed as barren. Most men here value fertility as a primary asset. Since that asset is absent, I'm bidding accordingly." It was an insult wrapped in logic, and everyone in the room recognized it as such. But it was also a valid point. The farmer looked between Blackwood and Rebecca, uncertain whether to be offended on her behalf or amused by the audacity. Rebecca's eyes found Blackwood's across the crowded basement, and for just a moment something passed between them. Not understanding exactly, but recognition perhaps. An acknowledgement that this man, whoever he was operating by a different set of rules than the conventional wisdom. "Do I hear more than $1? The auctioneer asked, his voice suggesting this was the most unusual turn of events he'd encountered in several years of conducting these transactions. The farmer shook his head slowly. "I'm not paying more than $1 to marry a woman everyone says can't give me children. I was hoping she could, but if that's off the table..." He retreated into silence. No other bids materialized. "Going once," the auctioneer said. "Going twice." "Sold to the gentleman for $1. Rebecca descended from the platform where she'd been standing, making her way toward Blackwood with movements that suggested she was still processing what had just occurred. Up close, she was even more striking. Her eyes were a grey-green that seemed to shift depending on the light, and they held an intelligence that was almost unsettling in a woman of her supposed circumstances. "Mr. Rebecca prompted, extending her hand. "Colonel Harrison Blackwood," he replied, taking her hand. Her grip was firm, confident, unsurprised by his title or his reputation. "And you are Rebecca Marie Hartwell?" "I am. Though I suspect you purchased me based on incomplete information, Colonel. The physicians who've declared me barren have been wrong before. I had a child once years ago before my circumstances became complicated. This was unexpected." Blackwood had assumed the barrenness claim would be straightforward, not complicated by past fertility. And I lost her when I was unable to afford proper care. She was sick and I had no money for a doctor. She died when she was 4 years old. After that, I had no further pregnancies for many years. The doctors assumed my grief had damaged something fundamental in me, but they were making assumptions based on limited experience. Rebecca's voice remained steady, but something flickered in her eyes. Old pain, carefully contained. "I'm not here because I'm broken, Colonel. I'm here because my circumstances became untenable, and this was the only path available to me." Blackwood found himself reassessing his purchase. He'd intended to acquire a compliant woman, someone grateful enough for rescue that she'd cooperate without question. Instead, he appeared to have acquired someone far more complex and considerably more likely to challenge him. "Why should I believe you?" he asked, partly genuinely curious and partly testing her. "You shouldn't," Rebecca replied. "You should verify with competent physicians of your own choosing. If they concur with the Boston doctors, you've lost $1 and can set me aside without significant loss. If they disagree, then perhaps you've made a better investment than you realized. Either way, you have nothing to lose except the dollar you've already spent." It was practical, logical, and delivered without defensiveness or pleading. Blackwood realized he was beginning to like her, which was not part of the plan. "I have a ranch 2 hours north of here," he said. 80,000 acres. Cattle, horses, a substantial house. I need a wife who can manage a household and produce heirs. The arrangement would be legitimate marriage, not indentured servitude. You would have position, security, and independence of thought within the bounds of matrimony. In exchange, I expect cooperation and eventually children." "How many children?" Rebecca asked. "As many as is biologically possible," Blackwood replied. "I'm 47. I want heirs before I'm too old to enjoy them." Rebecca nodded slowly, considering. "And if I cannot conceive, despite the physicians being wrong about my potential, if we marry and I prove truly barren, then we'll have married based on a false premise, but we'll make the best of it. I'm not a cruel man, Miss Hartwell. I'm a practical one. If the bargain can't be fulfilled, we'll renegotiate the terms of our arrangement. Then I accept," Rebecca said simply. "When do we marry?" Blackwood had expected negotiation, hesitation, demands for time to consider. Instead, Rebecca Hartwell accepted his proposal with the same matter-of-fact efficiency he used in his business dealings. "There's a justice of the peace in town. We could arrange it for tomorrow." "Tomorrow, then," Rebecca agreed. She paused, then added, "Thank you, Colonel, for the $1, for believing that incomplete information might mean incomplete conclusions. I won't waste your investment." As they made arrangements for the next day's ceremony, Blackwood found himself wondering what exactly he'd purchased. A compliant wife? A business partner? A woman with hidden depths he was only beginning to suspect? The only certainty was that his $1 purchase was about to transform his life in ways he couldn't yet imagine, setting in motion a chain of events that would challenge everything he'd assumed about himself, about women, about the nature of redemption and second chances. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The carriage pulled up to the Blackwood estate on a late afternoon in early April, dust swirling behind them as they climbed the long drive that cut through grazing pastures dotted with cattle. Rebecca pressed her face against the window, taking in the sprawl of the property with an expression that was difficult to read. The main house was impressive, a 2-story structure of red brick with white columns fronting a wraparound porch. surrounded by outbuildings that spoke to a well-established and meticulously organized operation. Colonel Blackwood had married her at the Justice of the Peace's office that morning. The ceremony had taken 15 minutes. There had been no guests, no celebration, no wedding night consummation. Instead, they'd returned to the ranch, and Blackwood had shown her to a guest room in the east wing of the house, instructing her to rest before joining him for dinner. The entire transaction had the feel of a business merger rather than a marriage, which was precisely what it was. Now, as the carriage came to a halt before the main entrance, Rebecca felt the weight of what she'd committed to settle across her shoulders. She'd been desperate when she'd put herself up for auction, yes, but desperation and clarity weren't mutually exclusive. She knew exactly what she'd agreed to. The question was whether she could deliver on promises she'd made about her fertility. Promises rooted in hope rather than certainty. A woman emerged from the house as they approached, perhaps 60 years old, with steel-grey hair and an expression that suggested she'd been managing households since before Rebecca was born. This was Martha Henderson, Blackwood's housekeeper, and, as it would become apparent, the true authority within the Blackwood estate. "Welcome, Mrs. Blackwood," Martha said, her tone suggesting she'd already heard the unlikely story of her employer's marriage and had formed opinions about it. "I trust your journey was comfortable." "It was," Rebecca replied, accepting Martha's hand. "Thank you for welcoming me. I imagine this situation is unusual." "Unusual doesn't begin to cover it," Martha said, though without apparent judgment. "But the Colonel has his reasons for things, and I've learned not to question them. Come, I'll show you to the master bedroom. The Colonel will want you settled before dinner." Rebecca followed Martha through the house, taking in details as she went. The furnishings were expensive but impersonal, suggesting they'd been selected by someone focused on quality and durability rather than aesthetics. There were few personal touches, no family photographs, no evidence of a woman's influence in the decoration or arrangement. This was the house of a man, lived in functionally but not warmly. The master bedroom was large, dominated by a four-poster bed with heavy mahogany frame and green velvet hangings. A dressing room connected to it, and beyond that a bathing chamber, luxurious by any standard, particularly for a frontier ranch. Martha showed her where clothing had been placed, basic necessities that Blackwood must have arranged despite their marriage happening so quickly. "The Colonel dines at 7, Martha said. "I'll send someone to help you dress if you'd like, or you can manage yourself. He's particular about punctuality, but not terribly demanding otherwise. At least, not that I've observed in the years I've worked for him." Alone in the vast bedroom, Rebecca sat on the edge of the bed and allowed herself to feel the enormity of what she'd done. 24 hours ago, she'd been preparing for a marriage auction, resigned to selling herself to whatever man would have her. Now she was the wife of a territorial magnate, living in luxury she'd never imagined she'd experience again. But luxury built on false pretenses was still a kind of deception, wasn't it? She told Blackwood the truth. She'd had a child once, had lost her to illness years ago when Rebecca was too poor to afford proper medical care. That loss had been accompanied by complications that the Boston physicians had declared would prevent future pregnancies. But Rebecca had never been entirely certain they were right. Grief could affect the body in ways that seemed permanent but might not be. Circumstances could improve fertility in ways that illness and poverty impaired it. She'd spent 3 years after her daughter's death living hand-to-mouth, working as a seamstress, a laundress, whatever employment she could find. The physician's verdict of barrenness had allowed her a kind of freedom. She hadn't needed to worry about unwanted pregnancies or finding a husband to avoid social censure. But now, having put herself up for auction with that verdict attached, she'd essentially made a bet against the doctors. What if she was right? What if she could conceive? What if she was wrong? Dinner at 7 found Rebecca in a pale blue dress that Martha had selected from the wardrobe Blackwood had provided. The dining room was formal, the table long enough to seat 20 guests, yet only 2 place settings had been arranged at one end. Blackwood was already seated, reviewing correspondence by lamplight. He looked up as she entered, taking in her appearance with the same practical assessment he seemed to bring to everything. "You clean up well," he observed, which Rebecca supposed was his version of a compliment. "Did you rest?" "Briefly." "Your home is beautiful, Colonel. It's a functional space," he replied, gesturing for her to sit. "I don't spend much time in it beyond what's necessary. Most of my days are spent managing the ranch operations. I expect that won't change significantly now that I'm married, though your presence may require some adjustment of my schedule." "I wouldn't want to disrupt your routines," Rebecca said carefully. "I'm here to integrate into your life, not to demand changes." "That's refreshingly practical," Blackwood said. Martha appeared with the first course, a soup that smelled of beef broth and vegetables. "However, I do want to discuss the logistics of our arrangement. I've sent word to a physician in Omaha, Dr. William Garrett, whom I trust considerably more than the Boston doctors who examined you. He'll visit the ranch in a week to conduct his own examination. I'll need you to be honest with him about your medical history." Rebecca's throat tightened slightly. She'd anticipated this, but having it stated so directly made the stakes feel more real. "Of course." "Additionally," Blackwood continued, "I've spoken to Martha about your responsibilities. You'll oversee the household management, though Martha will remain as head housekeeper since she understands the operations better than anyone. You'll be responsible for managing the social aspects of my position. There are functions that require a woman's presence, though they're infrequent. Beyond that, your primary responsibility will be bearing children. I'm not unreasonable about this. If conception doesn't occur within a reasonable time frame, despite both of us making efforts toward that end, we'll explore other options." "Other options?" Rebecca asked. "Adoption, most likely, or renegotiation of the marriage terms that allows for amicable separation." "I married you for pragmatic reasons, Mrs. Hartwell. If those reasons can't be fulfilled, I'm not interested in forcing the situation. I'm too old for dramatics." It was surprisingly reasonable, which somehow made it more difficult to accept. Rebecca had expected cruelty, or at minimum self-serving manipulation. Instead, she was encountering a man who'd calculated a problem and proposed solutions that were genuinely logical. They finished dinner discussing practical matters, the workings of the household, the seasonal rhythms of the ranch, the staff that would be under her purview. By the time they finished, it was past 9, and Blackwood stood, preparing to retire to his study. "I'll be working late tonight," he said. "I'll sleep in my dressing room. We can establish a schedule for the physical aspects of the marriage once Dr. Garrett has completed his examination. For tonight, you should rest. Tomorrow, I'll introduce you to the broader staff and show you the house properly." Rebecca lay in the vast master bed that night, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling into evening. Horses in distant corrals, wind moving through cottonwoods near the house, the occasional call of a coyote carried on the prairie wind. It was a lonelier sound than she expected, even among so much activity. The week before Dr. Garrett's arrival passed in a blur of adjustment. Martha took her through the house room by room, explaining the organization of the household, the preferences of the colonel, the rhythms that governed daily life. Rebecca met the household staff, the cook, the cleaning women, the stable hands, and began to understand the hierarchy and operation of the estate. She also began to observe the colonel more closely. He was efficient, certainly, and his business acumen was evident in every decision she observed him make. But he was also lonely, she realized, in a way that had nothing to do with his marital status and everything to do with the isolation that came from being fundamentally a man apart. He had business associates but not friends. He had employees but not companionship. He had a mansion but not a home. On the morning of Dr. Garrett's arrival, Rebecca was nervous in a way she hadn't been since the auction. The physician was a thin, scholarly man with wire-rimmed spectacles and an expression of professional detachment. He examined her in the bathing room, asking detailed questions about her medical history, her menstrual cycle, her previous pregnancy. "When was your last menstruation?" he asked, making notes on a small pad. 3 weeks ago, Rebecca replied. "Regular cycles, always have been," he nodded, continuing his examination with practiced efficiency. When he finished, he looked at her with something approaching surprise. "The Boston physicians were incorrect," he said finally. "There's nothing physiologically preventing conception. Your reproductive system appears entirely normal, healthy even. The barrenness diagnosis was likely based on incomplete information or insufficient examination." Relief and terror washed through Rebecca in equal measure. She was fertile after all, which meant she might be able to fulfill her bargain with Blackwood, which also meant that if she failed to conceive, it wouldn't be due to medical limitation but to chance or timing or some other factor, equally frustrating. Dr. Garrett spoke with Blackwood for nearly an hour in the Colonel's study, and when he emerged, he seemed pleased. He'd clearly recommended immediate efforts toward conception, and he'd likely given the Colonel medical guidance about optimal timing and approaches. That evening, Blackwood came to the master bedroom for the first time since their wedding night. He was perfunctory about it, approaching the situation with the same practical efficiency he brought to every other aspect of his life. He was not cruel, but neither was there tenderness or romance. It was a transaction executed efficiently, and afterward he returned to his dressing room. But it was a beginning, and as Rebecca lay alone in the darkness, she found herself mentally calculating if conception occurred this month, she would deliver 9 months from now. If it occurred the next month within a year, the mathematics of fertility began to consume her thoughts in a way she hadn't anticipated. The next morning, Martha found her in the kitchen before dawn, unable to sleep, and assigned her tasks that would keep her occupied. Cleaning, organizing, planning menus, work had always been Rebecca's solace, her way of managing uncertainty and fear through productivity. She had no idea then how prescient that coping mechanism would prove to be. 3 months into her marriage to Colonel Blackwood, Rebecca realized she was pregnant. The realization came not as a dramatic moment of revelation, but as a series of small, undeniable physical changes. The nausea that appeared in the mornings, particularly when Martha was preparing strong coffee in the kitchen, the sudden aversion to foods she'd previously enjoyed, the profound exhaustion that seemed to settle into her bones no matter how much she slept. And then, the absence of her monthly cycle, now 3 weeks overdue. She didn't tell Blackwood immediately. Instead, she rode into town and visited Dr. Garrett's office in Omaha, a 40-minute journey she undertook without informing her husband. The physician confirmed what her body had already told her. She was approximately 6 weeks along, healthy, with every indication of a normal progression. "Congratulations, Mrs. Blackwood," Dr. Garrett said, his professional demeanor warming slightly. "You're going to be a mother." Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes, surprising herself with the intensity of her emotional response. She'd thought she'd made peace with the possibility of never being a mother again, had accepted the physician's verdict as final judgment. Instead, her body had preserved the capacity she'd mourned as lost. That evening, she told Blackwood, they were dining privately, as had become their custom on nights when he wasn't entertaining business associates. She set down her fork carefully and met his eyes across the expanse of the table. "I'm pregnant," she said simply. Dr. Garrett confirmed it this morning. Blackwood set down his wineglass, his expression shifting through several emotions in rapid succession: surprise, satisfaction, something that might have been genuine pleasure. "How far along?" 6 weeks. "Excellent. Dr. Garrett is satisfied with your health." "He is. He said everything appears normal and healthy." Blackwood nodded, clearly calculating timelines and implications. "Then we should inform Martha and make arrangements for your care. Dr. Garrett will need to visit regularly. We'll need to prepare a nursery, hire suitable staff for childcare." He paused, and something in his expression shifted towards something almost resembling warmth. "This is good news, Rebecca. Better than I'd anticipated, actually." The fact that conception occurred so quickly suggests your body responded well to the medical care and improved circumstances. Rebecca was unsure how to respond to this clinical assessment of her pregnancy, so she simply nodded and returned to her meal. But internally, something had shifted. She'd successfully fulfilled the primary clause of their bargain. She was carrying Blackwood's child, a son, she was already certain. Though she couldn't articulate why, the months that followed transformed both Rebecca and her relationship with her husband in subtle but significant ways. As her pregnancy advanced, Blackwood's behavior toward her changed incrementally. He began asking about her comfort, ensuring she had appropriate seating and support. He insisted she not overextend herself with household duties, much to Martha's apparent satisfaction. The housekeeper had clearly harbored concerns about Rebecca working too hard during her delicate condition. When Rebecca suffered a bout of severe nausea in her 4th month, Blackwood arranged for Dr. Garrett to visit the ranch to ensure nothing was wrong, and he sat with her for hours afterward, not speaking, but maintaining a presence that was oddly comforting. During this period, Rebecca also began to understand the true scope of the Blackwood operation. The colonel was not merely a successful rancher. He was a businessman of considerable sophistication, with investments in railroads, banking operations, and territorial development. She observed him conducting business in his study, listened as he spoke with lawyers and financial advisors, and gradually realized that the ranch was actually the smallest piece of his empire. More intriguingly, she began to recognize that his reputation for ruthlessness was more complex than simple cruelty. Yes, he was demanding with his employees and unforgiving of incompetence. But he also paid fair wages, provided housing for families of his workers, and maintained a system of medical care and support that was remarkably progressive for the territory. Men worked for him not primarily out of fear, but out of respect for his competence and fairness. One evening in her 7th month of pregnancy, when her mobility had become significantly limited and she spent most of her time resting, Blackwood found her in the library, a room she'd discovered largely unused and had begun to claim as her refuge. Shelves lined the walls, filled with books that ranged from practical ranch management texts to philosophy, history, and even poetry. "I didn't know you read," Blackwood observed, noting the open volume of Barren on her lap. "There's quite a lot you don't know about me." "Colonel," Rebecca replied without defensiveness, "I spent 3 years in Philadelphia before circumstances forced me west. My mother was a teacher. She valued education, made sure I was literate and reasonably well-read before she died." Blackwood moved to the bookshelf, running his finger along the spines. "These books have been here for years, largely untouched. I purchased them thinking I should read more, should maintain some connection to intellectual pursuits beyond ledgers and cattle prices. Instead, they've gathered dust." He pulled down a volume of Emerson's essays. "What do you think of him?" They talked for 2 hours that evening, beginning with Emerson and expanding into broader philosophical territory. Rebecca discovered that Blackwood, despite his gruff exterior and pragmatic nature, possessed a genuinely curious mind. He'd read extensively in his youth, before the demands of building his empire had consumed his time. But the intellectual curiosity remained, dormant but not extinct. "I want our son to have what I didn't," Blackwood said eventually. As the evening had grown late and Martha had begun lighting lamps against the approaching darkness. Education, yes, but also the space to develop his own interests, not simply to inherit my business concerns because it's expected. "I want him to have choices. How do you know it's a son?" Rebecca asked. "Intuition," Blackwood replied. "Though I suppose I'm not particularly invested if it's a daughter. Though I confess I'm uncertain how to be a father to a girl." "Boys seem more straightforward," Rebecca smiled. "I suspect fatherhood to either sex will require you to learn some humility, Colonel. That may be the greatest challenge you've faced." To her surprise, Blackwood laughed, a genuine sound that emerged rarely enough to startle her with its authenticity. The child was born in early December, in the midst of a blizzard that isolated the ranch for 3 days. Dr. Garrett arrived just before the snow became impassable, and he remained at the house as Rebecca's labor progressed through the night. The delivery was difficult. The baby was large, Rebecca's frame smaller than ideal for childbirth, but ultimately successful. The child was indeed a son. Blackwood named him Alexander after his grandfather, and Rebecca saw something in his expression when he held the infant for the first time that suggested the colonel was capable of vulnerability after all. He was awkward with the baby, uncertain how to support the impossibly small head, worried he'd break something irreplaceable. But the care was evident in every tentative movement. "He's perfect," Blackwood said finally, looking at Rebecca with an expression that contained gratitude and something deeper. "Thank you." Over the following months, as Rebecca recovered from childbirth and adjusted to motherhood, the dynamic of her marriage continued to evolve. Blackwood spent more time at the house, more time with his son, more time engaging with Rebecca in conversation beyond the perfunctory. He was not suddenly a warm man. His fundamental nature remained pragmatic and reserved, but the coldness had been tempered by something that resembled genuine affection. It was during this period that Rebecca made a decision that would reshape her entire trajectory within the Blackwood household. She was nursing Alexander one afternoon, sitting in the sunlit nursery that had been prepared with Martha's help, when a young man, one of the ranch hands, appeared at the door looking distressed. "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Blackwood," he said, removing his hat, "but there's a situation in the south pasture. One of the breeding mares is in distress, and the colonel's in Omaha on business. The foreman sent me to ask if you could come advise. You've been around horses longer than most of us, and the situation's urgent." Rebecca looked down at Alexander, who was contentedly nursing, then back at the young man. She'd been raised around horses, had worked with them before her life had fractured. Her expertise in animal husbandry had been one of the skills that had made her somewhat valuable in the marriage market, mentioned briefly during the auction before being overshadowed by the barrenness verdict. She handed Alexander to Martha, who'd been hovering nearby, and made her way to the south pasture despite the fact that she was still in the delicate early months of postpartum recovery. What she found was a mare in genuine distress, likely experiencing complications with a breached birth. The situation required immediate intervention, and the ranch hands, while competent with general animal husbandry, lacked the specific knowledge necessary to handle this particular emergency. Rebecca worked for the next 3 hours, directing the men, applying knowledge she'd retained from her younger days, managing what was a genuinely life-threatening situation for both mare and foal. By the time Blackwood returned to the ranch that evening and learned what had occurred, the mare had successfully delivered a healthy foal, and both mother and baby were stabilizing. He found Rebecca in the barn, exhausted and dirty, sitting on a bale of hay while watching the mare and foal interact. "Martha told me what happened," Blackwood said, his tone difficult to read. "You should have been resting. You're not fully recovered from childbirth." "The situation was urgent," Rebecca replied. "The mare would have died without intervention, and the foal as well. I had knowledge that could make a difference. I used it." Blackwood was silent for a long moment, studying her in a way that suggested he was reassessing something fundamental about his assessment of her character. "You put your own health at risk. I calculated the risk and determined the benefit outweighed it," Rebecca said, meeting his gaze. "Isn't that what you always taught me to do? Think practically, act decisively, don't let sentiment override necessity." A smile tugged at Blackwood's mouth, though he attempted to suppress it. "You're throwing my own philosophy back at me. I learned from a good teacher." That evening, Blackwood made a proposal that surprised Rebecca entirely. He wanted to expand her role beyond the domestic sphere. He wanted her to begin advising him on horse operations, specifically on breeding programs that could improve the quality of his stock. He'd noticed her expertise with the animals, had observed her discussing bloodlines and genetics with the stable hands, and wanted to leverage that knowledge more formally. "You'll be paid a salary," he said, "equal to what I pay my stable manager." It's a business arrangement, distinct from your role as my wife and mother of my child. Martha can manage the household. You'll focus on operations, Rebecca accepted, recognizing this as both an opportunity and a form of trust. For the first time since her marriage, she wasn't simply fulfilling a predetermined role. She was being asked to contribute her own expertise, her own mind, to something that mattered. It was a profound shift, one that would have ramifications far beyond either of them could have anticipated in that barn on that December evening. 2 years into her marriage, Rebecca had transformed the Blackwood breeding operation from a moderately successful enterprise into something approaching legendary status. Her instincts for bloodline selection were remarkable, her ability to recognize genetic potential in individual animals uncanny. She'd implemented new protocols for tracking lineage, developed a system for identifying which animals should breed and which should be culled, and most impressively, had begun producing horses that were attracting attention from buyers across multiple territories. Buyers from Colorado, Wyoming, even California were inquiring about Blackwood stock. The operation that had been peripheral to the Colonel's primary cattle business had begun generating serious revenue. More importantly, Rebecca had found something beyond mere survival. She'd found purpose. Her second pregnancy arrived almost exactly 1 year after Alexander's birth. This conception had been neither planned nor accidental, but rather the natural consequence of a marriage that had evolved into genuine partnership. The physical relationship between Rebecca and Blackwood had also transformed, becoming less transactional and more intimate. Though Blackwood remained fundamentally reserved in his expressions of affection. Another son, "I suspect," Blackwood observed when Rebecca informed him of the pregnancy while they reviewed horse-breeding records in his study. "Why do you always assume sons?" Rebecca asked, though she was smiling slightly. "A daughter could manage the breeding operation equally well." "I don't doubt your capabilities," Blackwood replied, "but society certainly would. A daughter of ours would face complications you've managed to avoid through sheer competence and my deliberate choice to ignore social convention. A son would have fewer obstacles." It was a pragmatic assessment, and Rebecca recognized it as such. Nevertheless, she found herself hoping for a daughter, someone who might inherit not just her mother's knowledge but her determination, to claim space in a world that preferred women to remain decorative. The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Rebecca was more exhausted this time, managing both the physical demands of carrying a child and the operational demands of an increasingly complex breeding program. She'd hired 2 assistants to help with the work, both young men who'd proven themselves capable of learning her methods, but the responsibility ultimately rested on her shoulders. It was during the 5th month of this pregnancy that a situation arose that would test the true depth of the partnership Rebecca and Blackwood had built. A neighboring rancher, a man named Harrison Croft, whose property bordered Blackwood's land to the east, began experiencing unusual losses in his cattle herd. Initially, the losses seemed random, scattered across different pastures, suggesting disease or predators. But as the losses continued and intensified, a pattern began to emerge. The animals being lost were consistently from the highest quality stock, and they were disappearing in ways that suggested intentional removal rather than natural causes. Croft came to Blackwood with suspicions that bordered on accusation. Someone, he believed, was systematically stealing his best cattle, and he suspected it might be Blackwood, seeking to eliminate competition or acquire superior genetics without purchase. Blackwood's response was characteristically measured. He invited Croft to the ranch, showed him detailed records of his own herd movements, and suggested they investigate together. But internally, Rebecca knew her husband was insulted by the implication of theft. Blackwood had built his empire through shrewd business practices and calculated decision-making, not through dishonest dealing. Rebecca, however, had a different theory entirely. She'd been working with one of her assistants, a young man named James Brennan, who'd proven himself exceptional at tracking bloodline patterns and predicting breeding outcomes. James was intelligent, ambitious, and possessed a hunger for advancement that suggested he wasn't content remaining a stable hand indefinitely. He'd also been spending time away from the ranch on mysterious errands, always with plausible explanations, but increasingly with an evasiveness that troubled Rebecca. She shared her suspicions with Blackwood, carefully phrasing them as observations rather than accusations. "I'm not suggesting James is deliberately involved in theft," she said, sitting in the study as evening shadows lengthened across the floor. "But I believe he may have connections to whoever is stealing from Croft. His family has limited means. The opportunity to earn additional income by providing information about Croft's herd movements or locations would be tempting for someone with James's ambitions and limited resources. You think he's providing intelligence rather than personally conducting the thefts," Blackwood said. "Following her logic, I believe it's possible. And I think investigating that possibility might provide leverage to discover who's actually orchestrating the theft." Blackwood arranged a private conversation with James, not accusatory but deliberately informative. He explained that unusual losses had been occurring in neighboring herds, that such activities created instability in the territory, and that anyone with information regarding such matters would be wise to share that information with someone they could trust. He also made it clear that he valued James's competence and would not look kindly on deception, but that cooperation would be remembered favorably. James, faced with the apparent knowledge of his involvement and the implied threat, chose cooperation. He admitted that a man named Vincent Carrera had approached him weeks earlier, offering money for information about Croft's herd composition and pasture locations. James had provided the information, believing he was helping someone conduct legitimate business, but had begun to suspect that the information was being used for theft. With this information, Blackwood contacted territorial law enforcement, and within weeks, Carrera and his accomplices were arrested. The stolen cattle were recovered, Croft's losses ended, and the territory settled back into stability. But the situation had created complications. Carrera, facing prosecution, attempted to bargain for leniency by implicating Blackwood in the scheme. He claimed that Blackwood had orchestrated the thefts himself, using James as an intermediary, seeking to acquire Croft's breeding stock at a discount after the losses had weakened the other rancher's position. It was a lie. But it was a lie with just enough plausibility to create doubt in the minds of those less inclined to trust Blackwood's integrity. Rumors began circulating through Mesa Ridge and the surrounding territory. The most prominent rancher was apparently not above criminal activity to maintain his dominance. Perhaps the suspicions that had long existed about his ruthlessness had deeper foundations than previously believed. It was during this period of social uncertainty that Rebecca's second child was born in the late spring of her 28th year, delivering a healthy daughter with surprising ease, given her previous difficulty with Alexander's birth. Blackwood named the child Margaret, after his grandmother, and Rebecca observed something shift in him as he held his daughter for the first time. The pragmatic businessman seemed to transform into something more vulnerable, more protective, as though this small female child represented a future he desperately wanted to secure and couldn't quite accept he might be unable to fully control. "She's beautiful," Rebecca said, watching him from the bed where she was recovering. "She has your eyes. She has your strength," Blackwood replied, and there was something in his voice that suggested he understood the significance of that inheritance. The birth of Margaret coincided with the final resolution of the Carrera situation. The evidence ultimately vindicated Blackwood entirely, and the accusations against him were formally dismissed. But the rumors lingered, creating a subtle shift in how Blackwood was perceived in some circles. no longer entirely trusted, regarded with greater wariness by those who'd previously taken his integrity for granted. It was a subtle form of damage, the kind that couldn't be completely repaired through exoneration because it existed at the level of perception rather than fact. Rebecca addressed this indirectly by becoming more visible in territorial society. She began attending functions that Blackwood had previously attended alone, speaking with wives of other ranchers and business leaders, gradually rebuilding the social capital that Blackwood's reputation had damaged. She did this not through obsequiousness, but through genuine engagement, asking about their lives, their concerns, their perspectives on territory development and ranching operations. She discovered that many of these women possessed knowledge and insights that their husbands either ignored or actively discouraged them from sharing. Rebecca, by valuing their perspectives and demonstrating her own competence, gradually shifted the social narrative. Instead of being a woman purchased for $1 and now playing at motherhood, she became recognized as someone of genuine capability. Someone whose partnership with Blackwood was based on mutual respect and complementary expertise. It was during one of these social gatherings, at the home of the territorial governor's wife, that an opportunity presented itself that would transform Rebecca's financial independence in ways neither she nor Blackwood had anticipated. A woman named Eleanor Hastings, wife of a banking executive based in Denver, engaged Rebecca in conversation about the horse breeding program. Eleanor was wealthy in her own right, having inherited significant investments from her father, and she was actively seeking breeding stock for her own operation in Colorado. "I've heard extraordinary things about the Blackwood horses," Eleanor said, her tone suggesting she didn't believe in hyperbole. "Bloodlines specifically selected for both temperament and physical capacity. Is it possible to acquire breeding animals?" Rebecca explained the process, discussing the selectivity that went into which animals were available for purchase. Eleanor listened intently, and by the end of the conversation had expressed interest in acquiring 6 breeding mares and 1 stallion for a price that was substantially higher than standard market rates. "I recognize that what I'm acquiring is not just animals, but the knowledge and expertise that created them," Eleanor said frankly. "That should be reflected in the price. Additionally, if you're willing to provide guidance on implementing similar selection practices in my own breeding program, I'd be prepared to compensate you directly for that consulting work." Rebecca reported this conversation to Blackwood that evening. She expected him to be pleased with the sale and the expanded revenue opportunity. Instead, he was thoughtful. Studying her with an expression she'd learned indicated he was calculating larger implications. "You could establish your own operation," he said finally. "Using capital from these sales and consulting fees, you could purchase property, develop your own breeding program independently. You have the expertise and apparently the business acumen to succeed." Rebecca considered this. The implication was clear. Blackwood was offering her a path to financial independence, to ownership and authority that didn't depend on marriage to him. It was an extraordinarily progressive gesture for a man of his era and circumstances. "I'm not interested in independence from you," Rebecca said carefully. "But I am interested in security independent of you, if that's different. Something that would ensure that Margaret and Alexander, and any other children we might have, would have resources and stability regardless of circumstances. Then we'll establish a separate account," Blackwood said, "in your name entirely. The profits from the breeding sales and consulting work will go directly to you. It's your capital, your business, functioning within the framework of the ranch, but autonomous in terms of authority and decision-making." It was a gesture of extraordinary trust, and Rebecca understood it as such. By creating this independent financial foundation, Blackwood was ensuring that Rebecca would never be entirely dependent on him, never entirely vulnerable should something happen to him or their relationship change. 6 months later, as Rebecca discovered she was pregnant with their 3rd child, She was simultaneously building a financial empire that was pound for pound and profit for profit, beginning to rival Blackwood's own cattle operations. In terms of revenue generation, the Woman's Society had purchased for $1 was becoming the architect of her own fortune. The time Rebecca reached her 32nd birthday, she'd given birth to 5 children in as many years. After Margaret came Thomas, named for Blackwood's father. Then Catherine, a red-haired wildfire of a girl who seemed determined to defy every social convention before she could even walk properly. Following Catherine came William, born during a spring snowstorm that nearly claimed Rebecca's life, but resulted instead in a healthy child with his father's analytical mind. Most recently, there was Charles, born just 6 months prior, who possessed the unusual distinction of being the first Blackwood child to display what could generously be called a sunny disposition. The pregnancies had been relentless, barely enough recovery time. Between conceptions before Rebecca found herself pregnant again, Dr. Garrett had warned about the physical toll of such rapid successive pregnancies, had suggested that spacing might be medically advisable. But Rebecca had felt compelled to continue bearing children at the rate Blackwood desired. The man who'd purchased her for $1 wanted an empire of heirs, and she'd made an implicit bargain to provide one. Yet something fundamental had shifted in how she approached this biological reality. The first 3 pregnancies had felt like fulfilling an obligation, proving the physicians wrong, honoring a transaction. But somewhere around the 4th child, Rebecca's perspective had transformed. These weren't just Blackwood's heirs or evidence of her fertility. These were her children, individuals with distinct personalities, needs, and futures that she had responsibility for shaping. The transactional nature of her marriage had been subsumed by something far more complex and binding. The physical toll, however, was undeniable. Rebecca's frame, which had once been strong and well-proportioned, had begun to show the strain of repeated pregnancies and childbirths. She was thinner than before, her skin marked with the evidence of stretched flesh and rapid changes. Her energy, once seemingly boundless, required careful management. There were days when lifting Charles or playing with Thomas exhausted her to a degree that seemed disproportionate to the exertion. Blackwood noticed. It was Martha who first suggested, more directly, that something needed to change. The housekeeper found Rebecca attempting to review breeding records while simultaneously managing a fussy William and ensuring Catherine didn't climb into the stable loft, an apparently irresistible destination for the precocious 4-year-old. Mrs. Blackwood, Martha said, with the directness she'd earned through 20 years of managing the household. You need to stop. Rebecca looked up from the ledger she'd been pretending to focus on. Stop what? Stop trying to manage everything. Stop bearing children at a pace your body can't sustain. Stop running the breeding operation while raising 5 children under 5 years old. Something has to give, and I'm watching you deteriorate like a candle burning at both ends simultaneously. The Colonel would prefer a wife who's alive and reasonably healthy to a wife who's worked herself into an early grave, Martha interrupted. Men don't understand these things. They see children as a measure of success and fertility, as proof of worthiness, but they don't experience the actual cost. You do. That evening, Rebecca had a conversation with Blackwood that represented a significant departure from their previous interactions. Rather than presenting herself as capable and willing, she was honest about physical limitation. I can't continue at this pace, she said bluntly. My body is sending increasingly clear signals that it's reaching its limit. Dr. Garrett warned me after Charles was born that another pregnancy in the immediate term could be dangerous. I'm telling you this not as an excuse, but as a fact. Blackwood listened without interrupting, which was his habit when receiving information he considered significant. I've fulfilled the essence of our original bargain, Rebecca continued. I've proven the physicians wrong. I provided you with 5 healthy children, more than most men acquire in a lifetime. But I cannot continue bearing children at this rate without genuine risk to my health and potentially my life. I'm asking for your consideration of that reality." The colonel was quiet for a long time, clearly working through the implications. Finally, he spoke. "What do you propose?" "A pause," Rebecca said. "Not permanent, but extended. 2 years minimum, perhaps longer. Time for my body to genuinely recover. Time for the children already born to reach stages where they require less intensive physical management. Time for me to rebuild strength and capacity. And if I want another child sooner," Blackwood asked, though his tone suggested he was asking for information rather than making a demand. "Then we engage in a different arrangement," Rebecca said carefully. "Adoption, perhaps. Or we accept that the number of heirs we've acquired is sufficient for our purposes. But I'm not willing to risk my life to continue meeting your original specifications." This was a moment of genuine reckoning. Rebecca asserting boundaries in a way she hadn't since the early months of their marriage. The woman who'd accepted a $1 purchase price was now negotiating terms with the man who'd bought her. Blackwood's response surprised her entirely. "You're right," he said simply. "I've been operating under assumptions that were based on outdated calculations. The financial benefit of continued children is diminishing relative to the cost to your health. And I find I'm not actually willing to trade your survival for additional heirs. We have sufficient children." It was a surprisingly pragmatic reassessment, one that suggested Blackwood's capacity to adjust his thinking when presented with compelling logic had perhaps been underestimated. The decision created space for Rebecca to reclaim aspects of her life beyond motherhood. She resumed her involvement with the breeding program at a significantly reduced pace, focusing on strategic oversight rather than daily operations. She spent time with Eleanor Hastings, expanding the consulting work that had become remarkably lucrative. She began to experience what she recognized as contentment, not the desperate gratitude of her early marriage, but genuine satisfaction with her circumstances and her choices. The children, meanwhile, were developing into distinct personalities. Alexander, now 6 years old, displayed his father's analytical mind and methodical approach to problem-solving. He spent hours studying the operations of the ranch, asking questions that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of cause and effect. Margaret, at 4, possessed an unusual combination of her mother's physical competence and her father's business acumen. She was already negotiating with her siblings over toys and resources with the seriousness of someone conducting major transactions. Thomas had inherited his mother's empathy and his father's sense of responsibility. He was the child most likely to notice when someone was troubled and attempt to offer comfort. Catherine was pure chaos, energetic, fearless, and determined to test every boundary that existed. William possessed intellectual curiosity, matched only by emotional sensitivity. And Charles, the youngest, was already demonstrating the ability to charm anyone in his vicinity into providing exactly what he required. It was in watching these children develop that Rebecca began to understand something fundamental about the bargain she'd made. The transaction of $1 had initiated something that had transformed into genuine family. Not the manufactured obligation of marriage, but the organic connection of shared life and mutual investment. One afternoon, while sitting in the library reviewing breeding records, Rebecca was interrupted by the unexpected arrival of the woman from the marriage auction. Not Rebecca, but another woman, the one who'd been sold to the farmer for $20 and had, according to rumor, produced 4 children in 6 years before dying in childbirth. The woman's name was Sarah, and she'd survived, but barely. She'd come to the Blackwood Ranch seeking Rebecca specifically, having heard through the network of women who'd passed through the marriage auction that Rebecca had thrived rather than merely survived. Sarah was thin, pale, worn down by successive pregnancies and inadequate recovery time. Her husband had discarded her when she became unable to bear more children, and she was now living with her sister in town, attempting to rebuild something resembling a life. Rebecca listened to her story, recognized in Sarah's circumstances a version of what her own life might have become if she'd married a less pragmatic man or had less capacity for assertiveness, and made a decision that would have significant ramifications. "I'm going to help you," Rebecca said, "financially and otherwise, but not as charity. I'm offering you work, legitimate employment, overseeing the day-to-day operations of my breeding program. The salary is fair, and the position is autonomous. You'll be managing a significant operation and earning genuine income that belongs entirely to you." Sarah looked at her with an expression that mingled hope and disbelief. "Why would you do that?" "Because the marriage auction was designed to prey on desperation," Rebecca replied. "We were both desperate, both willing to accept terms we wouldn't have accepted under any other circumstances. You ended up with worse terms than I did, partly through bad luck and partly through marrying a man without the resources or inclination to treat you as I've been treated. I'm in a position to help correct that imbalance. Over the following weeks, Rebecca effectively transferred most of her operational responsibilities to Sarah, maintaining only strategic oversight while focusing her energy on her own children and her consulting work. Sarah, given meaningful employment and genuine autonomy, began to visibly recover. The color returned to her face. Her movements became less mechanical and more confident. She began to resemble the woman she'd been before the marriage auction had broken her. It was during this period that Eleanor Hastings visited the ranch with a proposition that would reshape Rebecca's financial landscape. "Entirely, I want to establish a formal business partnership," Eleanor explained, sitting in Blackwood's study with both Rebecca and the Colonel present. "Something structured, documented, entirely professional. You would retain your role as primary consultant on breeding operations, but additionally, I'd like to expand into supplying horses to various military operations and commercial enterprises. I believe your expertise could be valuable in identifying which bloodlines produce animals suitable for different purposes." Eleanor was offering Rebecca not just consulting fees, but actual partnership in an expanding business venture. The financial implications were substantial, and the offer was being presented to Rebecca as an equal business partner, rather than to Blackwood, with Rebecca as an auxiliary to his decision-making. Blackwood looked at Rebecca, clearly understanding that this decision needed to be hers alone. "I'm interested," Rebecca said, "but I want to understand the full scope before committing. What would the partnership structure look like?" Over the following days, Eleanor, Rebecca, and a lawyer from Denver worked out a formal partnership agreement. Rebecca would contribute her expertise and credibility in exchange for a percentage of profits and genuine authority over breeding decisions for the military and commercial contract work. It was a sophisticated business arrangement, one that positioned Rebecca as a genuine entrepreneur rather than a wife who happened to be intelligent. The partnership was formalized on a spring afternoon, with all three women signing documents that would prove remarkably prescient about the direction the territory and nation were heading. Within 2 years, the partnership was supplying cavalry mounts to the United States Army, generating revenue that made Rebecca's personal wealth rival Blackwood's in scope, if not yet in total accumulation. By the time Charles was 2 years old and Rebecca had remained free of pregnancy for nearly 3 years, a remarkable transformation had occurred. The woman purchased for $1 had become a successful businesswoman in her own right, a respected advisor to territorial development, and most remarkably, a person who'd maintained her marriage not through obligation, but through genuine partnership with a man who'd initially intended to treat her as a transaction. The $1 bargain had become, quite unexpectedly, the best investment either party had ever made. In the spring of Rebecca's 35th year, 5 years after she'd asked Blackwood to pause further pregnancies, she discovered she was pregnant again. The discovery came as something close to shock. Both she and Blackwood had accepted that their childbearing years were essentially concluded. They'd both been content with 5 children, had adjusted their lives accordingly. had begun planning for the futures of the children they'd already created, rather than anticipating additional ones. Yet here was undeniable physical evidence that Rebecca's body had other plans. Dr. Garrett, now elderly but still practicing, confirmed the pregnancy with a note of concern. "You're healthy," he assured her, "but this is unexpected given your age and the extended period since your last pregnancy. I want you to be monitored closely throughout. Your body has been through considerable stress with the previous 5 pregnancies in rapid succession. We'll need to be cautious," Rebecca told Blackwood that evening, not knowing quite what his reaction would be. The man who'd purchased her specifically to produce heirs had demonstrated over the past 5 years a capacity to prioritize her well-being over his desires. But this situation was different. The pregnancy had arrived not through design, but through what seemed like biological chance or perhaps deliberate choice by Rebecca's body itself. Blackwood was quiet for a long time after she told him. Then he asked a single question. "Do you want this child?" It was a question that surprised Rebecca with its implications. The answer wasn't obvious. She was established in her business operations. Her 5 existing children were at ages where they required less intensive mothering. Her body had made clear the cost of childbearing. There were legitimate reasons to consider not continuing this pregnancy, but when Rebecca examined her feelings honestly, she discovered something unexpected. She did want this child. Not because of any obligation, not because Blackwood wanted an heir, but because somewhere in the past 5 years, her relationship to motherhood had transformed from transaction to genuine desire. "Yes," she said finally, "I want this child, but I want to do this differently than the previous pregnancies." "How?" Blackwood asked. "I want to slow down significantly. I want to focus almost entirely on the pregnancy and recovery, reducing my business responsibilities to minimal levels. I want Dr. Garrett monitoring me constantly, and I want to be honest with everyone about the reality of what's happening, not hiding the pregnancy or minimizing the challenges, but acknowledging that at 35, carrying another child is a different situation than it was at 28. Blackwood nodded slowly. "That seems wise. I'll speak with Eleanor about temporarily reducing your consulting obligations. Sarah can expand her responsibilities with the breeding program. We'll prioritize your health and this pregnancy's success." The decision set in motion a series of changes that rippled through the Blackwood estate and the broader business operations. Eleanor Hastings, when informed of the situation, was remarkably understanding and supportive. She'd hired a new consultant to manage some of the military contract work, ensuring that Rebecca's absence wouldn't damage ongoing operations. But something else happened that Rebecca hadn't anticipated. Her pregnancy became a point of significant social interest and, surprisingly, inspiration. The society women who'd initially been skeptical about Blackwood's unconventional marriage began to regard Rebecca's continued fertility and the Colonel's apparent respect for her well-being as evidence of a marriage that was genuinely unusual and perhaps worth emulating. Rather than being the cautionary tale of a woman purchased for $1, Rebecca became someone interesting, a woman who transcended her origins through competence and partnership. More remarkably, younger women began to inquire about Rebecca's perspective on matters of marriage, family, and independence. She found herself, quite unexpectedly, becoming a kind of informal advisor to a generation of territorial women who were beginning to question the conventional wisdom about their appropriate roles. Rebecca was frank in these conversations. She didn't romanticize her marriage or pretend it had been easy. She acknowledged that she'd begun as a desperate woman, accepting the only available option. But she also made clear that her transformation from purchased commodity to genuine partner had required Blackwood to evolve as significantly as she had. She'd asserted boundaries. She'd demanded autonomy. She'd developed expertise that made her valuable beyond her reproductive capacity. And Blackwood had, to his credit, adjusted his expectations and behavior accordingly. The key, Rebecca told a group of younger women one afternoon, is recognizing that you have leverage you may not initially understand. Men like Colonel Blackwood respond to competence and clarity. If you're intelligent and capable and clear about what you will and won't accept, you have more power in negotiations than you might think. Don't accept the first offer. Don't settle for the first terms. And if someone won't respect your boundaries, don't marry them, regardless of the pressure or the alternatives. It was advice rooted in her own experience, and it resonated with women who'd been taught to be grateful for whatever marriage prospects they received. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through summer and into fall. Rebecca spent long hours in the library, reading everything she could about pregnancy, childbirth, and women's health. She took walks on the ranch property, maintaining her physical strength. She spent time with her 5 existing children, helping them understand that they were about to have a sibling, though she was careful not to position this as replacing or diminishing her relationship with any of them. Alexander, now 11, displayed his characteristic analytical approach by asking detailed questions about the biological mechanics of pregnancy. Margaret, at 9, was more interested in the practical implications. Would there be another room needed for the baby? Would Rebecca still have time for their regular rides? Catherine, 7 years old and incorrigible as ever, announced she intended to teach the baby to ride horses before it could properly walk. Thomas was quietly protective, as though Rebecca's pregnancy was his personal responsibility to ensure progressed safely. William and Charles, the 2 younger boys, simply wanted reassurance that the baby wouldn't require taking away the attention they received from their mother. It was during a quiet afternoon in November, with Rebecca entering her 8th month of pregnancy, that Blackwood made a proposal that demonstrated how profoundly their relationship had evolved. "I want to amend my will," he said, sitting with Rebecca in the library where she was resting. "I'm creating a separate trust for you, capital and property held entirely in your name outside my estate. It will pass to the children in equal measure if you predecease me, but during your lifetime it remains yours entirely, independent of my estate." Rebecca understood the significance of this. Blackwood was essentially ensuring that if something happened to him, Rebecca wouldn't be dependent on whatever their oldest son inherited, or however the Blackwood empire was divided among the heirs. She would have independent wealth and security. Why? Rebecca asked, though she suspected she knew the answer. "Because you've become irreplaceable," Blackwood said simply. "Not as the woman I married to produce heirs, but as the woman you've become. If I died tomorrow, I want to ensure that you could maintain the life you've built, that you wouldn't be vulnerable to any male heir deciding to restrict your autonomy or control your resources. I want you secure, Rebecca, genuinely secure." Rebecca was moved to tears by this statement, not because it was emotionally effusive, but because it represented the ultimate validation of her transformation. She was no longer a transaction. She was a partner, and a valued one. The 7th child was born on December 15th, exactly 8 years after Rebecca's marriage to Blackwood began. She was a daughter, small but healthy, with dark hair and Blackwood's distinctive grey eyes. They named her Eleanor, after Rebecca's business partner and friend, acknowledging the woman who'd provided not just financial opportunity but genuine friendship and support throughout Rebecca's years of intensive childbearing. This birth was different from the others in several ways. Blackwood was present throughout, something he'd never been for the previous deliveries. The physical difficulty was less than anticipated. Dr. Garrett suggested that Rebecca's experience with 5 previous births, combined with her excellent physical condition despite her age, meant this delivery was smoother than even the 3rd or 4th had been, and perhaps most significantly, this birth felt not like the completion of an obligation, but like a genuine choice, expressing itself physically. "She's perfect," Blackwood said, holding his newborn daughter with the comfort of a man who'd now practiced holding infants 6 times. "Thank you, Rebecca, for this, for everything. Eleanor's arrival sparked considerable discussion in territorial society. A woman of 35, already the mother of 5 children, delivering a 7th child successfully, was unusual and noteworthy. Some whispered that it was further evidence of Rebecca's exceptional fertility. Others suggested it demonstrated the importance of proper nutrition, medical care, and a supportive partner, the same factors that had made her previous pregnancies and recoveries successful. Rebecca herself recognized it as something different, the final proof that her body had never been broken, only that she'd been broken when it was being used up and used fast. Given time, rest, and appropriate care, her body had revealed itself capable of sustained childbearing well into her 30s. 2 weeks after Eleanor's birth, as Rebecca was recovering and establishing nursing patterns with her newest daughter, Blackwood made another announcement. He was planning to step back from active management of the cattle operation, turning those responsibilities to Alexander under the guidance of his longtime foreman, Marcus Webb. Blackwood himself would focus increasingly on the financial and investment side of the business, the banking relationships, the territorial development opportunities, the strategic thinking about where the territory was heading. "I'm 59 years old," Blackwood explained to Rebecca. "If I continue at my current pace, I'll likely not live to see my youngest daughter reach womanhood. I want to slow down, to be present more consistently, to be a grandfather to Alexander's children if he follows the conventional path. And I want to spend time with you that isn't exhausted time. Time when I'm not consumed by immediate business concerns." It was a proposal for a fundamentally different phase of their life together, one focused on relationship rather than accomplishment. Though accomplishment would certainly continue, the impact on the broader Blackwood operations was significant. With Rebecca managing the breeding and consulting business, Alexander taking on increasingly substantial cattle operation responsibilities, and Eleanor Hastings expanding the military contract work into a genuinely significant enterprise, the next generation was positioned to inherit not merely a ranch, but a diversified, sophisticated business operation, and perhaps most remarkably, the woman who'd been purchased for $1 had become essential to all of it. As 1910 drew to a close and Eleanor Blackwood entered her infancy, Rebecca found herself in a position she'd never imagined when she'd stood on that platform at the marriage auction. She was secure. She was respected. She was genuinely loved by a man who'd begun their relationship with purely transactional intentions. She had 5 adult children and 2 younger ones. She had business interests and financial independence. She had friendship and intellectual partnership. The $1 purchase had transformed into something far more valuable than either party had anticipated, a genuine marriage, built on mutual respect, sustained through partnership, and deepened through the shared experience of creating and raising a life together. By 1915, 5 years after Eleanor's birth, the landscape of the Blackwood enterprise had transformed in ways that would have seemed impossible during those early years of rapid pregnancies and uncertain partnership. Alexander, now 21 years old, had proven himself a capable manager of the cattle operations, though he'd approached the role differently than his father. Where Blackwood was ruthlessly efficient, Alexander brought a more collaborative approach that surprised many observers by proving equally effective. Margaret, at 19, had rejected the conventional path expected of wealthy ranchers' daughters. Instead of focusing on advantageous marriage prospects, she'd begun apprenticing with her mother in the breeding business, demonstrating a facility for the work that suggested she might eventually eclipse both Rebecca and Eleanor in terms of expertise. This choice had initially caused considerable social scandal. A young woman of her station, engaging in agricultural business, was considered unseemly by traditional standards. Blackwood's response had been characteristically pragmatic. He'd observed Margaret's genuine interest and capability, had assessed the business implications of having a skilled family member engaged in management, and had simply supported her choice. His willingness to defy social convention for the sake of practical advantage had gradually influenced how others perceived Margaret's unconventional path. If Colonel Blackwood could accept his daughter managing breeding operations, perhaps there was nothing scandalous about it after all. Thomas, at 17, had shown less interest in direct business operations and more interest in the territorial governance aspects of the family's influence. He'd begun attending political meetings, serving as his father's representative in discussions about territorial development and policy. He possessed his mother's empathy combined with his father's strategic thinking, making him surprisingly effective at negotiations that required both emotional intelligence and calculating precision. Catherine, at 15, remained a force of nature that defied categorization. She could work cattle with the best of the ranch hands, but she could also speak French and discuss literature with surprising sophistication. She seemed equally comfortable in boots and a riding habit as in a formal gown, and she'd somehow maintained friendships across the entire spectrum of territorial society, from wealthy ranchers' families to the daughters of merchants and professional men. William, at 13, displayed intellectual capacity that suggested he might pursue education beyond the typical ranch heir's training. He spent hours in the library with both his parents, reading everything from technical agricultural texts to philosophy to novels. Blackwood had begun to contemplate sending him east to university, a radical suggestion for a rancher's son that Rebecca had actually encouraged, and Charles, now 7 years old, was developing into a charmer of considerable ability, capable of persuading adults to his perspective through a combination of intelligence and affection that suggested he might become the most politically astute of all the Blackwood children. Eleanor, the youngest, was thriving, a beautiful, intelligent child who seemed to inspire genuine affection in everyone she encountered. She'd become somewhat of a mascot for the extended business network, and Blackwood's friends had a habit of inquiring about her well-being with a tenderness that suggested Rebecca's youngest daughter had secured an unusual position of universal approval. The broader business operations had continued to prosper. Eleanor Hastings' partnership with Rebecca had expanded exponentially, now supplying horses not just to military operations, but to commercial enterprises, ranches across multiple territories, and even some international buyers seeking specifically selected bloodlines. The profits from this enterprise had made Rebecca genuinely wealthy in her own right, wealthier now than many of the women who'd initially been skeptical about the Colonel's unconventional marriage. Rebecca, now in her mid-40s, had become something of a legend in territorial business circles. Stories circulated about the woman who'd been purchased for $1 and had built an empire through intelligence and partnership. Some versions of the story suggested she'd manipulated Blackwood into expanding her authority. Others positioned her as his equal from the beginning, with the Colonel simply recognizing capability when he saw it. The truth, as usual, was more complex than either narrative. Aloud, it was partnership built through mutual adjustment and genuine respect earned over years of shared challenges. It was during this period of relative stability and prosperity that Blackwood began to grapple with his own mortality in ways he previously hadn't. He was 64 years old, healthy but aware that his energy wasn't what it had been. He'd begun to contemplate what he wanted his legacy to be, not merely the financial empire, but the human and social legacy embedded in how his children approached the world. He commissioned a family portrait, something he'd never done before. The artist traveled from Denver, and over the course of 3 weeks captured the Blackwood family in various configurations. The final portrait, which would eventually hang in the main house for decades, showed the entire family arranged in a deliberately non-hierarchical composition. Blackwood and Rebecca were positioned not at the center, but integrated naturally with their children. The composition suggested partnership and equality rather than patriarchal authority. More significantly, Blackwood began documenting his business philosophy in writing. creating what he intended to be a guide for his children about how to approach their inherited responsibilities. The document was remarkably candid, discussing not just successful business practices, but failures and mistakes, lessons learned through error, and most unusually, specific acknowledgement of Rebecca's contributions to the family's success. "Your mother," he wrote, addressing his children directly, was purchased for $1 based on assumptions that proved entirely incorrect. She was declared barren by physicians who were wrong. She was expected to be grateful and compliant, and instead she became a partner and equal. "Your mother's greatest gift to this family wasn't her ability to bear children, though she did that successfully. Her greatest gift was her refusal to accept the limitations others tried to impose on her capacity. Learn from her example. Question assumptions, including assumptions others make about you. And when you discover someone of genuine capability and character, recognize that and adjust your expectations accordingly." It was a remarkably progressive document for a man of Blackwood's generation and circumstances, and it suggested that his evolution had been as significant as Rebecca's. In the spring of 1916, Eleanor Hastings, now in her 60s, began experiencing health complications that she initially attempted to manage but eventually acknowledged as serious. She developed a heart condition that would likely prove fatal within a few years. She called Rebecca to her home in Denver and made a proposal that had significant ramifications for the future of the business partnership. "I want to restructure the partnership," Eleanor said, sitting in her study as afternoon light streamed through the windows. "I want to transfer my share of the business to you entirely, Rebecca. You'll own the enterprise outright, and you can determine how to manage it going forward. Margaret can eventually inherit it if she chooses, or you can restructure it differently. But I want it to remain in your hands, not passed to my own heirs, who don't possess your expertise or commitment to excellence." Rebecca was reluctant to accept this generous bequest. "Eleanor, that's an enormous transfer of value. What about your family?" "My family has been well provided for," Eleanor replied. "What matters to me now is ensuring that the enterprise we built together continues in the right hands." "You are those hands, Rebecca. You have been from the beginning." Eleanor's death came 2 years later in 1918, just as the world was being reshaped by the conclusion of a global war that had seemed impossibly distant to most territorial residents, but had affected them nevertheless. The military contracts that had sustained much of the Hastings-Blackwood partnership had shifted as war production priorities changed, and Rebecca found herself managing a transition that was both financially challenging and strategically complex. But she was no longer a woman who'd been broken by circumstances. She was a woman of capability and experience who'd navigated multiple transitions successfully. She restructured the business, pivoting from military supply to commercial breeding operations, maintained existing relationships while developing new markets, and managed to not only preserve the enterprise, but actually expand it into new territories. Margaret, now 24 years old, worked alongside her mother through this transition, and by the time stability had been re-established, it was clear that Margaret would eventually take over the enterprise entirely. The daughter of the woman purchased for $1 was positioning herself to become a business leader of substantial influence in her own right. It was during this period that Blackwood experienced a significant health crisis. In the fall of 1919, he suffered a stroke that left him partially paralyzed and unable to speak with complete clarity. It was a devastating development for a man who defined himself through control and clear communication. Rebecca managed the immediate crisis with the same competence she'd brought to every other challenge. She ensured he received proper medical care. She managed the household through the upheaval. She delegated business responsibilities to Alexander and Thomas while maintaining oversight of strategic decisions. And she sat with her husband during his recovery period, speaking to him, reading to him, maintaining the connection between them even as his ability to respond was compromised. Blackwood recovered enough mobility to function within the house, though he never regained his previous physical capacity. He also eventually recovered much of his speech, though the effort was clearly significant and he tired more easily than before. It was a humbling experience for a man who'd built his identity around competence and control. And it created a profound shift in his relationship with Rebecca. "I owe you my life," he said one afternoon, his speech still labored but comprehensible, as Rebecca helped him to the porch where he could observe the ranch operations from a distance. "Not literally, though, perhaps that too. But my life as I want to continue living it. I owe that to you." "You don't owe me anything," Rebecca replied. "This is what partnership is. You've supported me through challenges. I support you through yours. It's not equal," Blackwood said. "You've given far more—" "Stop!" Rebecca interrupted gently but firmly. "Stop trying to calculate and keep score. We built something together. It sustained both of us. It's enough." Over the following years, as Blackwood's mobility gradually improved but never fully recovered, their relationship entered a new phase. The Colonel became increasingly focused on mentoring his children rather than direct business operations. He spent hours with Alexander discussing cattle breeding strategy. He worked with Thomas on political and territorial development issues. He encouraged William in his intellectual pursuits and supported his eventual decision to attend university in Boston. He delighted in Eleanor, now approaching her teens, and seemed to view his youngest daughter as a gift that transcended the transactional beginning of his marriage to her mother. And he sat with Rebecca in the library, reading together as the sun descended in the evenings, at peace with a life that had begun with commerce and evolved into genuine partnership. By 1925, 16 years after Eleanor's birth and 23 years after Rebecca had been purchased for $1, the Blackwood family had become something of a model for unconventional success. 5 of the 7 children had established themselves in various capacities, Alexander managing the family cattle operations, Margaret operating the breeding enterprise, Thomas engaged in territorial politics, Catherine managing a small ranch of her own that she'd purchased with earnings from breeding work, and William establishing himself as an educator after returning from university. Charles had followed an unexpected path into journalism and was beginning to make a name for himself as a writer documenting the transformations occurring in the territory. Eleanor, the youngest, was finishing her education with private tutors and beginning to consider her own path forward. The woman purchased for $1 had become the foundation of a family legacy that would extend far beyond any single generation's business success. She demonstrated that circumstances of origin didn't determine capacity or character. She'd proven that partnership could evolve from transaction, and she'd created an environment where her children felt empowered to chart their own courses rather than simply inheriting predetermined paths. It was a remarkable transformation, one that had required both Rebecca's courage in asserting herself and Blackwood's willingness to adjust his assumptions about what was possible in a marriage. By the late 1920s, the story of Rebecca Blackwood had become widely known throughout the territorial society and beyond. Journalists had begun to take interest in the narrative of the woman purchased for $1, who transformed herself into a successful businesswoman. Some accounts were romanticized, portraying her as a Cinderella figure rescued by a benevolent millionaire. Others were more cynical, suggesting she'd manipulated Blackwood into expanding her authority through calculated seduction and strategic reproduction. The truth, as always, was far more complex and considerably less dramatic than either narrative allowed. It was during this period that Rebecca began receiving inquiries from women, some respectable, some desperate, all of them seeking advice or assistance based on the perceived success of her unconventional marriage. Letters arrived regularly at the Blackwood Ranch, forwarded from newspaper offices and territorial journals that had published articles about her life. Some writers asked for guidance on negotiating better terms in their own marriages. Others sought employment opportunities, hoping that Rebecca might be able to assist them in finding positions with the breeding operation or related enterprises. Rebecca responded to these inquiries with the same practical directness that had characterized her approach to every other challenge. She didn't position herself as a model or an inspiration. Instead, she provided honest assessment of what had made her situation work and what wouldn't transfer to others' circumstances. She emphasized that her success had depended on multiple factors: Blackwood's unusual capacity for pragmatism, her own competence and willingness to assert boundaries, fortunate timing and genuine opportunity. She was careful not to suggest that the path she'd taken was universally replicable, or that her story validated any particular approach to marriage or women's roles. However, her willingness to engage with these inquiries began to create something unexpected, a kind of informal network of women who were attempting to navigate unconventional paths in a society that actively discouraged such attempts. Some were business owners seeking advice on managing operations. Others were married women attempting to establish financial independence within the context of existing marriages. Still others were simply seeking reassurance that alternatives to complete conventional compliance existed. It was during this period of increasing attention that Blackwood experienced another health crisis, more severe than the first stroke. In the winter of 1929, he developed pneumonia following influenza, and for several weeks it was genuinely unclear whether he would survive. Rebecca managed his care with the same competence and devotion she'd brought to every other challenge in their marriage. But she also recognized that this crisis was different, that her husband's body was demonstrating clear signs of reaching its limit. Blackwood recovered from the pneumonia, but he was markedly diminished afterward. His mobility, which had gradually improved following the stroke, began to decline again. His energy diminished noticeably. He began to spend most of his time in the library or his study, no longer attempting to oversee ranch operations, even from a distance. It was during this period of decline that he called all of his children together for what he clearly intended to be a significant conversation. They gathered in the main house on an afternoon in early spring. The 7 Blackwood children ranging in age from 31-year-old Alexander to 17-year-old Eleanor, all of them bringing their own lives and concerns, all of them recognizing that their father was attempting to communicate something important before his capacity to do so diminished further. "I want you to understand your mother," Blackwood began, his voice still carrying authority despite its reduced volume and occasional hesitations. "All of you. Understand her not as the woman you know from childhood or adolescence, but as the woman she was when I met her. She was desperate, yes, but not broken. She was intelligent, but not educated. She was capable, but untested. She had the potential for something more. But that potential was being wasted in circumstances that didn't allow for its expression." He paused, gathering his strength, while Rebecca sat beside him with her hand resting on his arm. "I purchased her because I needed something specific," he continued. "I thought I was being pragmatic, making a business transaction. I didn't understand that I was actually acquiring a partner, though I didn't recognize that for quite some time. Your mother understood it before I did. She asserted boundaries, she developed expertise, she demanded respect, and I eventually recognized that my initial assessment had been incomplete." "Father," Margaret interjected gently, "we understand this. We've all benefited from the partnership you and Mother built." "I'm not telling you this for gratification," Blackwood replied, with something approaching his old sharpness. "I'm telling you this because I want you to understand something that I don't think your generation fully grasps. The transaction that created your mother's entry into our family wasn't shameful because it was honest. It was a clear exchange of value. She knew what she was agreeing to. I knew what I was seeking. The shame would have been in either of us attempting to disguise or romanticize the reality. Instead, we acknowledged it, managed it, and allowed it to evolve into something different. He looked directly at Eleanor, his youngest daughter. You're approaching adulthood in a very different world than your mother was. You have options she didn't have. But don't waste those options by pretending that circumstances don't matter or that pragmatism is somehow less worthy than romance. Your mother was pragmatic, and pragmatism has served this family extraordinarily well. The gathering lasted for several hours, and by the time it concluded, Blackwood was clearly exhausted. But he'd accomplished what he'd apparently set out to do. He'd ensured that his children understood the reality of their mother's position and the significance of her contributions to the family's success. Blackwood recovered enough mobility to function within the house, though he never regained his previous physical capacity. He also eventually recovered much of his speech. Though the effort was clearly significant and he tired more easily than before, it was a humbling experience for a man who'd built his identity around competence and control. And it created a profound shift in his relationship with Rebecca. "I owe you my life," he said one afternoon, his speech still labored but comprehensible, as Rebecca helped him to the porch where he could observe the ranch operations from a distance. Not literally, though, perhaps that too. "But my life as I want to continue living it. I owe that to you." "You don't owe me anything," Rebecca replied. "This is what partnership is. You've supported me through challenges. I support you through yours. It's not equal," Blackwood said. "You've given far more—" "Stop!" Rebecca interrupted gently but firmly. "Stop trying to calculate and keep score. We built something together. It sustained both of us. It's enough." Over the following years, as Blackwood's mobility gradually improved but never fully recovered, their relationship entered a new phase. The Colonel became increasingly focused on mentoring his children rather than direct business operations. He spent hours with Alexander discussing cattle breeding strategy. He worked with Thomas on political and territorial development issues. He encouraged William in his intellectual pursuits and supported his eventual decision to attend university in Boston. He delighted in Eleanor, now approaching her teens, and seemed to view his youngest daughter as a gift that transcended the transactional beginning of his marriage to her mother. And he sat with Rebecca in the library, reading together as the sun descended in the evenings, at peace with a life that had begun with commerce and evolved into genuine partnership. By 1925, 16 years after Eleanor's birth and 23 years after Rebecca had been purchased for $1, the Blackwood family had become something of a model for unconventional success. 5 of the 7 children had established themselves in various capacities, Alexander managing the family cattle operations, Margaret operating the breeding enterprise, Thomas engaged in territorial politics, Catherine managing a small ranch of her own that she'd purchased with earnings from breeding work, and William establishing himself as an educator after. Returning from university, Charles had followed an unexpected path into journalism and was beginning to make a name for himself as a writer documenting the transformations occurring in the territory. Eleanor, the youngest, was finishing her education with private tutors and beginning to consider her own path forward. The woman purchased for $1 had become the foundation of a family legacy that would extend far beyond any single generation's business success. She demonstrated that circumstances of origin didn't determine capacity or character. She'd proven that partnership could evolve from transaction, and she'd created an environment where her children felt empowered to chart their own courses rather than simply inheriting predetermined paths. It was a remarkable transformation, one that had required both Rebecca's courage in asserting herself and Blackwood's willingness to adjust his assumptions about what was possible in a marriage. By the late 1920s, the story of Rebecca Blackwood had become widely known throughout the territorial society and beyond. Journalists had begun to take interest in the narrative of the woman purchased for $1, who transformed herself into a successful businesswoman. Some accounts were romanticized, portraying her as a Cinderella figure rescued by a benevolent millionaire. Others were more cynical, suggesting she'd manipulated Blackwood into expanding her authority through calculated seduction and strategic reproduction. The truth, as always, was far more complex and considerably less dramatic than either narrative allowed. It was during this period that Rebecca began receiving inquiries from women, some respectable, some desperate, all of them seeking advice or assistance based on the perceived success of her unconventional marriage. Letters arrived regularly at the Blackwood Ranch, forwarded from newspaper offices and territorial journals that had published articles about her life. Some writers asked for guidance on negotiating better terms in their own marriages. Others sought employment opportunities, hoping that Rebecca might be able to assist them in finding positions with the breeding operation or related enterprises. Rebecca responded to these inquiries with the same practical directness that had characterized her approach to every other challenge. She didn't position herself as a model or an inspiration. Instead, she provided honest assessment of what had made her situation work and what wouldn't transfer to others' circumstances. She emphasized that her success had depended on multiple factors: Blackwood's unusual capacity for pragmatism, her own competence and willingness to assert boundaries, fortunate timing and genuine opportunity. She was careful not to suggest that the path she'd taken was universally replicable, or that her story validated any particular approach to marriage or women's roles. However, her willingness to engage with these inquiries began to create something unexpected, a kind of informal network of women who were attempting to navigate unconventional paths in a society that actively discouraged such attempts. Some were business owners seeking advice on managing operations. Others were married women attempting to establish financial independence within the context of existing marriages. Still others were simply seeking reassurance that alternatives to complete conventional compliance existed. It was during this period of increasing attention that Blackwood experienced another health crisis, more severe than the first stroke. In the winter of 1929, he developed pneumonia following influenza, and for several weeks it was genuinely unclear whether he would survive. Rebecca managed his care with the same competence and devotion she'd brought to every other challenge in their marriage. But she also recognized that this crisis was different, that her husband's body was demonstrating clear signs of reaching its limit. Blackwood recovered from the pneumonia, but he was markedly diminished afterward. His mobility, which had gradually improved following the stroke, began to decline again. His energy diminished noticeably. He began to spend most of his time in the library or his study, no longer attempting to oversee ranch operations, even from a distance. It was during this period of decline that he called all of his children together for what he clearly intended to be a significant conversation. They gathered in the main house on an afternoon in early spring. The 7 Blackwood children ranging in age from 31-year-old Alexander to 17-year-old Eleanor, all of them bringing their own lives and concerns, all of them recognizing that their father was attempting to communicate something important before his capacity to do so diminished further. "I want you to understand your mother," Blackwood began, his voice still carrying authority despite its reduced volume and occasional hesitations. "All of you. Understand her not as the woman you know from childhood or adolescence, but as the woman she was when I met her. She was desperate, yes, but not broken. She was intelligent but not educated. She was capable but untested. She had the potential for something more. But that potential was being wasted in circumstances that didn't allow for its expression." He paused, gathering his strength, while Rebecca sat beside him with her hand resting on his arm. "I purchased her because I needed something specific," he continued. "I thought I was being pragmatic, making a business transaction. I didn't understand that I was actually acquiring a partner, though I didn't recognize that for quite some time. Your mother understood it before I did. She asserted boundaries, she developed expertise, she demanded respect, and I eventually recognized that my initial assessment had been incomplete. "Father," Margaret interjected gently, "we understand this. We've all benefited from the partnership you and Mother built." "I'm not telling you this for gratification," Blackwood replied, with something approaching his old sharpness. "I'm telling you this because I want you to understand something that I don't think your generation fully grasps. The transaction that created your mother's entry into our family wasn't shameful because it was honest. It was a clear exchange of value. She knew what she was agreeing to. I knew what I was seeking. The shame would have been in either of us attempting to disguise or romanticize the reality. Instead, we acknowledged it, managed it, and allowed it to evolve into something different." He looked directly at Eleanor, his youngest daughter. "You're approaching adulthood in a very different world than your mother was. You have options she didn't have. But don't waste those options by pretending that circumstances don't matter or that pragmatism is somehow less worthy than romance. Your mother was pragmatic, and pragmatism has served this family extraordinarily well." The gathering lasted for several hours, and by the time it concluded, Blackwood was clearly exhausted. But he'd accomplished what he'd apparently set out to do. He'd ensured that his children understood the reality of their mother's position and the significance of her contributions to the family's success. She established the Blackwood Foundation for Women's Economic Independence, a substantial charitable organization funded by her personal wealth and dedicated to providing financial support and mentorship to women seeking to establish or expand business enterprises. The foundation didn't simply provide money, it provided access to Rebecca's own network, guidance in navigating business operations, and most importantly, validation that women's economic ambitions were legitimate and worthy of support. The foundation's first year saw applications from over 200 women. Rebecca personally reviewed the most promising proposals and selected 15 recipients for substantial grants. Among these recipients were a woman seeking to establish a printing business in Denver, a widow attempting to expand her family's textile operation, a group of women who wanted to create a cooperative agricultural enterprise, and several others whose ambitions ranged from modest local operations to genuinely transformative business visions. To the surprise of many observers, the success rate for foundation-supported enterprises was remarkably high. Rebecca's insistence on sound business planning, realistic financial projections, and mentor relationships with experienced advisors meant that the women she supported were actually equipped to succeed, rather than simply provided with capital and left to navigate their own challenges. But beyond the economic impact, the foundation created something equally significant, a visible demonstration that women could think strategically about business, could manage complex operations, and could generate substantial financial returns. Each successful enterprise established by a foundation recipient became evidence against the prevailing assumption that women belonged in domestic spheres rather than commercial ones. Margaret, Rebecca's oldest daughter, and now established as the primary operator of the breeding enterprise, observed her mother's expansion into foundation work with interest and eventual enthusiasm. By 1933, Margaret had formalized her own role as primary heir to the breeding operation and had begun implementing innovations that her mother had conceptualized but never fully developed. Specifically, breeding horses not just for quality, but for documented pedigree and verified bloodline records that could be maintained across generations and transferred with reliable information to subsequent owners. The innovation transformed the breeding enterprise from a successful business into something approaching an industry standard. Buyers throughout the West began insisting on the documentation protocols Margaret had established, effectively setting standards that other breeders had to follow to remain competitive. Margaret, at only 39 years old, had positioned herself as a thought leader in her field. Thomas, Rebecca's second son, had taken a different path. He'd become deeply involved in territorial and eventually state politics, eventually running for and winning a seat in the state legislature. In that position, he advocated for policies that surprised many observers: support for women's education, reformist economic policies that challenged some conservative orthodoxy, and surprisingly progressive positions on labor issues. His voting record and speeches made clear that he'd inherited his mother's pragmatism and his father's strategic thinking, but applied to social and political questions rather than business operations. Catherine had continued to manage her personal ranch operation and had expanded into genuine ranching, enterprise that was no longer simply an avocation, but a genuine business. She'd never married, having observed her mother's marriage with sufficient clarity to understand that matrimony wasn't a prerequisite for a meaningful life. Instead, she devoted her energy to ranching operations and to maintaining an extensive network of friendships and business relationships. William, the intellectual child, had eventually established himself as an educator, teaching at a university in California. He'd published several books on agricultural economics and had become recognized as an important voice in emerging discussions about how agriculture and industry might coexist in a modernizing America. Charles, the journalist, had continued his work documenting territorial and Western life. His articles, which had appeared in prominent national magazines, were credited with creating more nuanced and complex portrayals of Western life than the simplified narratives that typically dominated national media. He'd also written a substantial biography of his father that, while clearly admiring, was also unflinchingly honest about Blackwood's limitations and failures. Eleanor, the youngest and the daughter, born during Rebecca's barren years, had surprised everyone by establishing herself as a social advocate. She'd become involved in labor reform movements, women's education initiatives, and various progressive causes. She credited her mother's example with demonstrating that women could think seriously about social questions and could work toward systematic change rather than accepting existing conditions as permanent. By the mid-1930s, the Blackwood family had become a kind of social phenomenon, a family where multiple members had achieved significant accomplishments in diverse fields, where women held positions of genuine authority and influence, and where the younger generation seemed to take for granted possibilities that their parents' generation had had to fight to create. Journalists periodically returned to interview Rebecca, attempting to understand how she'd created a family environment that seemed to produce such accomplished and independent-minded individuals. Her responses were always pragmatic and skeptical of their own tendency toward romanticism. "I didn't create anything deliberately," she would say. "I simply demonstrated that women could work, could think, could accomplish things beyond bearing children and managing households. My children saw that and extrapolated from it. The remarkable thing would have been if they hadn't developed their own ambitions, given the environment they grew up in." She was equally skeptical of credit for her children's accomplishments. "They've done what they've done because they're intelligent and determined," she would explain. "I provided opportunity and didn't actively prevent them from pursuing their ambitions. That's not wisdom, that's simply common sense." As Rebecca moved through her 60s, she began to focus increasingly on documenting her own story, not through interviews, but through personal letters and journals that she didn't immediately intend for publication. She wanted, she explained to her children, to ensure that the actual record of her life, not the romanticized versions that had circulated through magazines and newspapers, would be available for future generations to understand if they chose to look for it. These documents were remarkably candid. They discussed her desperation during the years before the marriage auction. They acknowledged her initial deception about her fertility status, not a deliberate lie, but an honest uncertainty that she'd presented with more confidence than the facts strictly warranted. They discussed her struggles as a new mother while managing household responsibilities, her fears when she'd discovered she was pregnant yet again, her genuine physical suffering during those years of rapid successive pregnancies. but they also documented her pride in what she'd accomplished, her genuine affection for Blackwood even when she was frustrated by his rigidity, and her understanding that her own success had depended on circumstances and luck, as much as on her own capability and determination. "I was fortunate," she wrote in one passage, "in ways I didn't recognize at the time. I was fortunate that Blackwood was intelligent enough to evolve when confronted with evidence that his initial assumptions were incomplete. I was fortunate that I possessed capabilities that were genuinely valuable in the context where I found myself. I was fortunate that circumstances allowed me to develop those capabilities rather than suppress them. Many women in my circumstances would have encountered none of these fortunate factors. That I did doesn't make me special, it makes me lucky." Rebecca also began a direct mentorship role with younger women who were attempting to establish themselves in business or academic contexts. She didn't advertise this mentorship. It happened quietly, through letters and occasional meetings, through introductions to her network, and through careful guidance on navigating systems that had been designed to exclude women from positions of authority. One young woman who benefited from Rebecca's mentorship was Eleanor Blackwood, not Rebecca's daughter, but a distant cousin of her late husband who'd come to work at the Blackwood Foundation. This Eleanor had significant administrative capabilities, but limited connections and no family wealth to support her ambitions. Rebecca recognized her potential, mentored her extensively, and eventually positioned her to become the Foundation's executive director, a position that gave her genuine authority and influence over how the Foundation's resources were deployed. By the time Rebecca reached her early 70s, she created something that transcended any single business accomplishment or family achievement. She'd created a network of women who understood that economic independence was possible, that business competence wasn't gender-specific, and that systematic change was achievable if sufficient people committed to working toward it. She'd also created a family legacy that demonstrated, across multiple generations and diverse fields, that women could think, lead, accomplish, and contribute at the highest levels when given the opportunity to do so. In 1945, at age 73, Rebecca received a letter from a young woman she'd never met. The woman had read Margaret Price's original article about Rebecca's life, had followed the trajectory of the Blackwood family through subsequent decades, and wanted to express gratitude for the example Rebecca had provided. The letter read, in part, "I grew up hearing about the woman purchased for $1 who'd built an empire. I didn't realize until I was older that your story was also a story about refusing to accept limitations, about insisting on partnership rather than subordination, about understanding that desperation doesn't define capacity. My own path has been far easier than yours, in part because you and women like you demonstrated that an easier path was possible. I wanted you to know that your legacy extends beyond your own accomplishments and your own family. You changed what seemed possible for women you never met." Rebecca kept that letter in a drawer beside her bed, and she would occasionally take it out and reread it, particularly on days when she felt the weight of years and wondered whether her efforts had ultimately mattered. She died peacefully in her sleep in the winter of 1948 at the age of 76. She'd lived for nearly a half-century after her purchase at the marriage auction, had built a business empire, raised 7 children, created a foundation that had supported hundreds of women, and fundamentally shifted how at least some sectors of society understood women's capabilities and roles. The newspaper obituaries that appeared after her death were lengthy and substantial, but they struggled to capture what was most significant about her life. They discussed her business accomplishments, her philanthropic work, her influence on her children, but they had difficulty articulating what might be her most important legacy, that she'd lived as a woman who refused to be defined by her circumstances, who insisted on partnership rather than subordination, and who'd used whatever influence she'd acquired to demonstrate to other women that alternatives to complete conventional compliance existed. Her great-grandchildren would grow up in a world dramatically different from the one in which Rebecca had been born, a world where women could attend universities, practice professions, own property autonomously, and participate in civic and economic life as something approaching equals. They would largely take for granted possibilities that Rebecca had fought quietly and persistently to create. And somewhere in that future world, young women would encounter stories about a woman who'd been purchased for $1 and had built an extraordinary life, and they would understand that they, too, had the capacity to refuse limitation, to insist on partnership, and to build lives of genuine meaning and accomplishment. The $1 transaction had transformed not just one woman's life, but had rippled across decades and generations, changing what seemed possible for people who'd never directly encountered Rebecca Blackwood, but had benefited from the precedent she'd established. Through her refusal to accept the limitations others had attempted to impose on her. In the end, that was perhaps the greatest investment Colonel Harrison Blackwood had ever made. Not in cattle or land or financial securities, but in a woman who'd refused to remain what society had deemed her to be, and who demonstrated through her own extraordinary life that transformation was possible, that partnership could be genuine, and that a life that began in desperation could become something remarkable if someone had the courage and determination to insist on it. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.